So this is really presenting the themes from a new book that's about to come out, certainly internationally, and then in September in Australia, which is called Are Filter Bubbles Real? And that's what it looks like. They've done some nice work, I think, with the cover. We were kind of tempted to superimpose perhaps the logos of Facebook and Twitter onto the surface of the bubble, or maybe just the head of Donald Trump, but in the end, we kind of decided against that. Let me start, I guess, by saying a little bit about filter bubbles. And in fact, because these terms are always mixed up with each other, I will be talking both about filter bubbles and echo chambers in this, because they are so often used together and interchangeably, even in the scholarly discussion, in the mainstream media discussion as well. So why are we even interested in this? Why are we worried about filter bubbles, echo chambers? Why this discussion? Well, here's an example of the sorts of worries. This is Barack Obama's farewell speech as US president, where he says, well, there are lots of problems in society, but particularly it's become safer for many of us to retreat into our own bubbles, in our neighborhoods, our college campuses, our place of worship, or especially on our social media feeds. And I've highlighted this here because so much of what we talk about in this context is, of course, social media. So the assumption with these terms, with these concepts, is that we are surrounding ourselves only with like-minded people who look like us, who share the same political outlook, never challenge our assumptions, and that therefore ultimately society fragments into these individual groups that have nothing to do with each other anymore, whether it's Republicans and Democrats in the US or other political groupings, particularly in other countries as well. And of course, these things have really bubbled up. I'll try and stay away from the puns, but these things have kind of emerged more and more, of course, particularly after Brexit, after the 2016 US election. No doubt we'll talk about it now in the aftermath of this election again, too, in Australia. And, in many of these sort of circumstances, particularly, of course, when we find suddenly that opinion polls are badly wrong in a number of these cases, and we see some very different results, and we kind of wonder, well, what's to blame for this? Why is this the case? What's going on here? Why is the electorate moving in a different way from how it was predicted to move? And of course, one easy answer, one easy thing to blame there is perhaps social media, is perhaps the way that people inform themselves via social media and via online media more broadly as well. A lot of this actually goes back quite a way, and it's interesting if you look at some of the sort of formative texts in all of this as well. A number of them refer directly back to Nicholas Negroponte's work when he talked about the daily me in a book called Being Digital. And this is the mid-90s, so this is basically prehistoric by internet terms. So what he said at that point, what he was predicting at that point, not necessarily, by the way, as a negative, but simply as kind of a natural development of technology that would come quite soon from his perspective, was that we would soon have these personalized news portals, essentially, that would give us news that's specifically targeting us, our interests, our specific personal individual interests. And of course, the more the platforms know about us, the more they will do this. So in the end, we all have the Daily Me. We wouldn't have the Daily Telegraph or any other kind of daily newspaper. We'd have the Daily Me that's specifically directed just at us and is different, possibly quite entirely different from the next person and the next person. Clearly, this certainly hasn't happened in the newspaper context, in the news context more broadly, and it certainly didn't happen any kind of personalization didn't happen very quickly at the time. This was from the mid-1990s, but it took at least until the early 2000s for any kind of real personalization to really emerge, and even then only very haltingly. So this was quite possibly overhyped at the time. It was certainly a useful prediction and a useful kind of pointer, but it simply didn't happen, and didn't happen as quickly as perhaps predicted. But this was something that was really taken up by some of the proponents of these terms like echo chambers and filter bubbles. So Cass Sunstein, a legal scholar in the US who talked about echo chambers in the context of US elections particularly as well, and in fact kind of had a book around this in the context of the Bush Jr. versus Gore election in 2000. He really coined that term echo chambers, or applied the metaphor of echo chambers to the online political discussion environment. And he referred directly back to the Daily Me as sort of a culprit in developing these echo chambers. And then a little bit later, Eli Pariza, who's a tech entrepreneur, I guess, really started to talk about filter bubbles as kind of an alternative concept, I guess, that was sort of similar but sort of different as well. They were never really quite properly defined, unfortunately. But these were the sorts of terms that really emerged then over time. The problem with these is no one's really ever defined them. Sunstein doesn't, Pariser doesn't. They often just argue from anecdote. The first question, obviously, is, well, what do we actually mean by any of this? What are they meant to mean? What's the problem, and where should we look for them as well? Let's go through some of these questions. Where should we look for them? Well, Pariser talks about filter bubbles at first, specifically in the context of search engines. And his founding anecdote, essentially, is that he asked two friends around the time of the big oil spill in the Gulf in just off Texas. He asked two friends basically to search for BP, and one of them found information apparently about the oil spill. The other one found stock market information. So from that he basically said, well, they're getting totally different information. They must be living in different filter bubbles. That's really the founding anecdote of that. Of course, again, Sunstein and others talked about echo chambers and to some extent filter bubbles in the context of news portals as well, news recommender systems. And of course, much more recently now, we're talking about echo chambers and filter bubbles, sometimes interchangeably, particularly in the context of social media, where again, we need to kind of ask, well, what part of social media, what platforms, and through what mechanisms? So some people talk about the information that you get on your profiles that, the Facebook algorithm recommends to you, perhaps. Some people talk about the pages on Facebook as echo chambers. So you might have an anti-vax page and that becomes an echo chamber. Some people have looked at hashtags on Twitter in that context. And of course, there's also Facebook groups. And again, they could perhaps be seen as echo chambers there as well. There's a bunch of different places where people are looking, and we're not really entirely clear exactly where we should be looking and how we would know if we find them there as well. Then the question becomes, well, not just where are we looking, but what are we looking for? So if we see particular structures in these platforms, well, what would actually constitute an echo chamber or a filter bubble in these spaces? Does it need to be a hermetically sealed kind of space? So do these people need to be entirely cut off from the rest of the world and just talk amongst themselves, just connect and engage amongst themselves? Is that what we're looking for? Is it enough in a sense just for them to kind of reinforce each other, but perhaps still engage outward with others and try and push their hyper-partisan views? Is that what we're looking for? Or is it really even just any kind of partisan community, even if they're still quite well connected and engaging with others, if they're just basic communities of interest, communities of ideology, is that enough to call them an echo chamber or a filter bubble? All of these models, all of these views have been proposed, and it's again not really quite clear what we actually should be looking for, at what point something turns from just a little community to a filter bubble and so on. The question also is, well, why, if they are there, if we can actually detect them, what would be the mechanisms that form them, through which they form? So is it because of existing ideological polarization, societal polarization that is basically just expressed in these online spaces? Is it because of the role of algorithms that are shaping information flows, shaping what we encounter, what we don't encounter in these platforms? Is it a feedback loop between the two? So is it technologically or socially determined, if you like? And of course, there's all sorts of interesting questions there that go back to the very old arguments about technological determinism versus social constructivism and so on. So what is it exactly? What are the mechanisms? What are the dynamics that drive any of this as well? That's obviously one of the more fundamental questions perhaps in all of this as well. The fundamental question, or the fundamental problems, we just don't have any workable definitions. Again, Pariser, as I've said, basically builds his entire argument on an anecdote. He starts with this anecdote of the two people searching for BP, finding different results, and from that has a bunch of TED Talks basically that say there's a filter bubble. But nowhere in his book or books is he actually defining exactly what he means by filter bubble. Sunstein also doesn't really. They kind of both use these metaphors and use them quite evocatively and quite effectively, but again, they don't ever really fundamentally define from a media, communication, whatever studies kind of background, what exactly they would mean and where the thresholds are perhaps for something to be an echo chamber or a filter bubble, what empirical evidence we would have to look for to demonstrate that there is an echo chamber or filter bubble. And part of that, I'm sorry to say, maybe has something to do with the fact that they're both from non-cognitive disciplines. Sunstein's a legal scholar. Pariser is, well, he calls himself an activist and tech entrepreneur, I think that's the term he uses. I don't mean to belittle these professions in any way. And of course, tech entrepreneurs know a lot about tech as well, but neither of them give us any kind of really operationalizable definitions straight off the bat that we can use to actually test empirically for the existence of these concepts. So that's a really fundamental problem, and one I think that a lot of the research in this field also hasn't really grappled with enough. Even in the scholarly work that builds on these concepts, they're often taken for granted, and there's not very often clear definitions and fundamental definitions being offered for what these terms are. So that's a very significant problem. First question really is, well, what even are they? What do we mean by any of this? My approach to this, I guess, is perhaps building on network analysis. I think both of these are fundamentally related ultimately to network structures, particularly in the social media sort of context, because ultimately it is about how people communicate with each other, how people connect with each other, how information flows across these connections. So I think network science, if you want to call it that, network analysis can actually give us some useful tools for trying to detect these structures and trying to even assess the severity of these structures, because it isn't just the fact, of course, that they either exist or they don't exist, but it might be a matter of how exclusionary they are as well. That's, I think, where we need to push towards. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think that's really where we need to start and actually to do something about this. And of course, this is made worse still by the very ill thought out take-up of these terms also in the mainstream media discourse. So we've got people, well, I'm sorry to say, we've got Barack Obama talking about filter bubbles as well. We've got many others, of course. I mean, Scott Morrison talks about the Canberra bubble. Donald Trump does the same. And that, people on either side of politics do this, of course. These terms, again, are often just used in mainstream discourse, even just in everyday language, just as terms that don't need any further reflection, that are just basically accepted. And I think that's a problem, because we need to critically interrogate what we actually mean by them. And unless we have a kind of a clear understanding of what we mean by them, I think they're not particularly useful. In fact, I have seen, and for the book, obviously, in quite a few of the studies I've looked at, there are lines that say, well, we are looking at echo chambers, brackets, AKA filter bubbles. Or filter bubbles, sometimes also called echo chambers. So that's a really significant problem. If we as scholars, if we as scientists in this field don't actually have a clear definition, and we just kind of use these terms in an offhand common sense way, if we just kind of use them interchangeably, well, then that makes it very difficult to actually have a significant argument about whether they do exist or how severe the problem might be if they do exist. So that's, I think, something that we, again, need to push back against. We need better definitions. We need better ways of actually thinking through these terms and operationalizing them in empirical research as well. My approach to this, and I will acknowledge up front, it's not the only one, and other people have other ideas that are also perfectly defensible, but the way I'm approaching them here and in the book is to think about echo chambers as referring to connectivity. So how people are connecting with each other. If you think of Facebook, if you think of Twitter, if you think of social media platforms, obviously who's following whom, who's friending whom, and so on. So whether or not there exist closed groups that are only connected amongst each other and not with the wider world outside, versus whether there are people that might be in clusters but still well connected to others outside of those clusters as well. That would be a measure of echo chamberness, if you like. And I'm thinking of filter bubbles more in terms of the communication that actually happens amongst people. Because of course, if you connect with someone, it doesn't necessarily mean that you also actively communicate with them. And just because you haven't connected with someone doesn't mean that you can't also still communicate with them. I'm trying to distinguish these two types of connection a little bit here to make the two terms a bit more distinct and a bit more different from each other, and be able to use them in different ways as well. And I'll give you a fuller definition in a moment, but essentially kind of to show this graphically. So with echo chambers, then if you think of these red circles that I've got on screen there as internally connected groups of people who are just disconnected from anyone outside, then that's what I would call an echo chamber. So that ultimately what happens in these groups doesn't necessarily move to the outside of them, and it's much harder for information to travel inside as well. Whereas with filter bubbles, whatever the actual underlying connections are, it's the question of who they communicate with, who they choose to communicate with. So even within an echo chamber, you could have multiple separate filter bubbles of people who just connect with each other and don't talk to others within the echo chamber. And of course, you could also have filter bubbles that only overlap echo chambers, because people might choose to connect with a certain group of people, but communicate with a very different group of people. Think of these as two layers of connectivity that are layered on top of each other. And of course, if they are entirely matching in terms of their connections, then they basically amplify each other as well. So if all of us are only connected with each other in this room and not with anyone on the outside, and if we choose only to communicate with each other as well, then that's kind of that doubles the effect that this has compared to all of us connecting but still having communication with others on the outside as well. So I know this is again, this is disputable, and we can talk about this, but in terms of actually being able to operationalize these terms in a way that distinguishes them from each other, that's the approach that I'm choosing to take for the time being. So to put this into words, this is the definition that I'm then using for echo chambers. It comes into being when a group of participants choose to preferentially connect with each other to the exclusion of outsiders. And the more fully formed that network is, so the more connections are created within the group, the more connections with outsiders are severed, the more isolated from the introduction of outside views is the group. If information flows predominantly across the connections that we've made, then obviously the more we're just internally connected, the more any kind of communication stays within that space as well. And the views of all of us in that space are circulating widely within it, but very little outside impulses are coming in. Whereas then, by comparison, the filter bubble in that definition emerges when a group of participants, independent of the underlying network structure of their connections with others, choose to preferentially communicate with each other to the exclusion of outsiders. So the more consistently then they exercise that choice, the more likely it is that participants' own views and information will circulate amongst group members rather than any information that's introduced from the outside. Again, we can argue more about this. I'm happy to talk more about this, obviously, in questions afterwards as well. But for the moment, let's just run with this just to make these two terms a bit more distinguishable. And the other point to make about this then also is that, of course, none of these definitions actually talk about what might cause these formations. So they could be personal choice. They could simply be how people choose to connect or communicate with each other. But of course, they could also be strongly influenced or determined by algorithmic recommendations on options and offerings. So the algorithms of the platforms that you're using, of course, might also recommend to you people to connect with, people to communicate with, and that might then influence whether or not people are being essentially pushed into echo chambers or filter bubbles. But it is, I mean, quite likely it's both of these factors, and depending on perhaps the design of particular platforms, the affordances of platforms, one or the other might dominate, or they might just exist in a feedback loop as well, of course. That the algorithms learn from how we connect with each other, and so our further connection choices are very strongly influenced by what the algorithms then offer us as well. So for the moment, I'm being agnostic basically about whether it's technologically or socially determined what's happening here, but these are the definitions essentially that I'm going to use for the time being. Having introduced those terms, then, well, what can we actually say about echo chambers and filter bubbles? What's the evidence that's already out there in the literature, in the existing studies for their existence, and what evidence might there be for the fact that they don't exist? This again goes back to a certain way. So let's start with perhaps this idea of echo chambers. One of the first studies that pointed to at least what the authors at that point called mild echo chambers was this fairly famous study of interconnections between blogs in the 2004 US election by Adamich and Glantz. They basically looked at how these blogs on either side of politics were interlinking with each other, interconnecting with each other, and found, well, this structure there. It's interesting there that already we're seeing qualifiers creep in there. So you're seeing they're not talking about echo chambers as such, they're talking about mild echo chambers. So this already shows that it's a matter of degree of how connected or disconnected different groups are from each other, and that ultimately determines perhaps what an echo chamber actually is. Again, in the graph there, you see, of course, there's a red and a blue blogosphere, but there are also blogs somewhere in the middle that may be more neutral or may just serve as real discussion grounds, I guess, or grounds on which arguments happen between the different sides. So these are not disconnected from each other. There isn't a Democrat and a Republican blogosphere, and never the twain shall meet. But there is actually connection between the two as well. So if there is an echo chamber, in that context, it is mild, whatever we might mean by mild, but it could be measured, of course, through network metrics, essentially, how connected or disconnected these groups are. More recently, we've seen a move more towards more modern forms of social media, Twitter, Facebook. A lot of the focus is on Twitter because it's simply a lot easier to get data out of Twitter, which is a problem, of course, because Twitter is certainly not the most used social medium, but that's where we are at this point, unfortunately. And so studies like this by Williams et al. Give us, again, network graphs that tell a story, but kind of a complicated story. The top row here is the follower network, the middle row is the retweet network, the bottom row is the mentions network for a number of selected hashtags: climate change, global warming, and AGW, which I guess stands for anthropocentric global warming. And you're seeing there's some very different structures, both in terms of the connection types and in terms of how this plays out on the different hashtags. So in this case, if you look at the follower networks, well, two of these at least show some fairly strong polarization and disconnection perhaps between climate change deniers and the people who believe in the scientific consensus on climate change. In the retweet network, that is even more pronounced, I think, for the most part. But in the mentions network, they're all kind of talking amongst each other and perhaps not friendly, but certainly are talking at each other, depending on what kind of function of these platforms you're looking at, whether you're looking at essentially what I'd call the echo chamber side, which is the top row with the follower network, or the filter bubble side, which is the retweet and mention interactions. You see very different stories, and you see also very different stories depending on what hashtag you're looking at. Williams et al. Basically conclude from that, well, in some cases, there's what they call open forums where all sides are discussing amongst each other. In some cases, there are what they call echo chambers. Now, that's already problematic because if you are on a hashtag and you have an open forum in terms of, let's say, the mention interactions, but an echo chamber in terms of the retweet interactions, do you actually have an echo chamber there? Because if these people still see each other, well, are they actually in echo chambers? If they're interacting, if they're connecting with each other, are they still in echo chambers actually in that case? Clearly, they are not separated from each other entirely. So again, maybe at most there is a mild echo chamber or a mild filter bubble that exists here. Of course, then the question is whether these people might also engage with multiple of these hashtags at the same time. So if you're in an echo chamber in one hashtag, but not in another, then you can't really be in an echo chamber in terms of your overall Twitter use, I guess, either. So this is where it becomes a lot more complicated. Plus, they also find that this whole graph is actually for the leading users, for the most active, the most engaged users, but the casual participants show a lot less of that separation tendency. So again, it also depends on how active you are. And if you are a more casual user, you might actually be more connected, and you might your interactions, your mentions and retweets and following connections might actually start to break down or break through the walls of the echo chamber or the filter bubble as well. So it's complicated, is I guess the short way of putting this. On the other side of the story, we see through other forms of research that people say to Pew Center, for instance, in the context of the US election, they say in their own view that on both Facebook and Twitter, the majority of views that they encounter is actually either mixed or different from their own political ideology. So they do encounter counter-attitudinal views, counter-attitudinal participants. So again, by their own description, these users do not live in echo chambers and filter bubbles in that case, if they're seeing stuff that doesn't agree with their political views. And in fact, they're saying, well, I'm seeing so much of this. I wish I could block more people. I wish I could put myself more into an echo chamber or a filter bubble, but I've been unable to do that because they just keep popping up. So from that perspective, that's, I guess, strong evidence against the idea that people are able to lock themselves away or are being locked away by the algorithms even into echo chambers and filter bubbles. This was a really interesting study as well. A lot of these are actually in the context of elections, but that's maybe not such a bad thing because they actually, that's a kind of a point of heightened polarization potentially. So if we expect to see echo chambers and filter bubbles, then probably there we would actually expect to see them the most. This was done by a newspaper in Germany, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, ahead of the German federal election in 2017, where, and this is a little bit complicated, but I think it's interesting, they looked at people who like the pages of the major German political parties and then looked at what other pages these people also like. And then they looked at the overlaps basically in interests between the people who like these party pages. And they found that basically everything you see there sort of from the middle to the left, and they've kind of arranged them by political persuasion as well. So the AfD on the far right there is literally on the far right, and everything else is left from there. They actually found that there's a very significant amount of overlap in overall interests on Facebook beyond politics between the followers of all of the other parties. So they like the same news outlets, the pages of the same news outlets on Facebook. They like the same sports stars. They all like football, of course. They like the same celebrities, comedians, entertainment pages, and so on. So there is actually a lot of similarity in terms of the interest amongst these people outside of the followers of the AfD, who are mainly liking pages about, well, anti-immigration and other sort of more or less fascist interests, basically. This again shows that there is a very significant overlap, and that these people, because they're all interconnected also via these other interests, do not exist in echo chambers, because they are, in fact, very, very thoroughly interconnected, except for the far right, the political fringe. So if there is an echo chamber, and that's the conclusion that they drew as well, if there is an echo chamber, it exists on the very fringes of society, and particularly on the right, but not so much anywhere else in sort of mainstream society. And this is work that we did at QUT on the Austrian Twitter sphere. So what we did for this particular study was to map the follower network structure in the Austrian Twitter sphere. We found in total, up to 2016, we found about 3.7 million Australian Twitter accounts. We captured their follower networks and then mapped these. And this is the structure that we found. Again, as a network structure, this is overall very well interconnected. There aren't any clusters that are, or there's practically none, with a handful of exceptions, there's practically no clusters that are entirely disconnected from the network. The largest one that's a little bit off, and that's sort of off to the right, there is the teen culture cluster. But even they are still very strongly connected with the rest of the network via celebrities and via entertainment stars. Some outliers, for obvious reasons, are a cluster that you might be able to just see of porn accounts. The porn accounts, now obviously there's a reason that they might be disconnected from the rest of the network, because no one presumably is admitting that they're following porn accounts, and no one's really, no ordinary person is perhaps likely to publicly follow porn accounts, but they all follow each other, of course. So that's separate to one side. The other one that's kind of separate to the other side is this one here, which is education accounts. The reason for that, I think, is that if you're a teacher and you're running a Twitter account, you'll probably run this exclusively for teaching, and you're only connecting exclusively with other teachers, because you don't really want your students or the parents of the students or anyone else to know what political interests you have, what sporting interests, what cultural interests you have. So I think these are exclusively run for that particular purpose, and that's why they end up being quite separate in the map as well. Again, in the Austrian Twitter sphere, we do not see fundamental disconnections across the network, and we've looked at this from a number of different angles. We just don't find any fundamental disconnections. So information travels, certainly has the potential to travel quite freely across this network, and there aren't any kind of very obvious separating points within the network itself. So from any of these perspectives, for a number of different media, for a number of different platforms, we just don't see any evidence here of echo chambers, filter bubbles in that, in the sense that we should be seeing them according to what the literature says or what the proponents of these terms say. It's interesting, quite recently, there's also been a move back to looking at filter bubbles in the original definition that Eli Pariser put forward in search engines. So his point, again, was, of course, that because of Google and the way it personalizes search results, 3 different people search for different things, they find 3 different sets of results. And so they live, and those are personalized, of course, based on what Google knows about your interests. And so they all live in different filter bubbles, and they may have very different information diets. Well, unfortunately, that's just not borne out in the empirical data through a number of projects just over the last couple of years. So a piece that's come out just this year by Nehushtai and Lewis looked at search results for political queries in the US. and looked particularly at the news results. So I think they used Google News from memory. I think actually they looked at both Google Search and Google News to see what results they would get for particular queries across I think 150 participants. And they found that there is a very significant overlap in the results that people who declare themselves to be conservatives or liberals are getting. There is very little variation. As it says, there are 41 of 47 outlets. In fact, there's a graph there. 41 of 47 news outlets were recommended both to conservatives and liberals. And in fact, there's a handful of major sites, and you see the New York Times, CNN, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, CNBC, Business Insider. It goes down after a while. Just a very small number of dominant news sources that are recommended to pretty much anyone, independent of what Google knows about them, whether Google thinks they're liberal or conservative or whatever else, to the point where actually this article says, well, it would actually be nice if Google gave us more variety rather than just pushing us to the New York Times and CNN all the time. So if there is a filter bubble in that sense, it's actually a national filter bubble that encapsulates everyone in the US rather than individual ideological persuasions. There's a very similar study that was done in Germany as well, that found very similar results as well. In addition to that, there's also been a very large-scale test, again, that was done in Germany by an organization called Algorithm Watch. This is kind of the best graph I found. I'm sorry it's in German, but I'll say a bit more about it. So what they did was work with a browser plugin. They worked, I think, with Spiegel and Süddeutsche Zeitung to encourage as many people as possible to install a browser plugin. And in the end, I think they had 1,500 people who installed it. And that plugin would basically search every few hours for a set of search terms and report back what was on the first page of the Google search results, basically, for those terms. And it found that these results were largely identical, and that even they were largely in the same order, even for different people. For any two randomly selected users, there's a 5 to 10% chance that they get exactly the same results in exactly the same order. And if it's not exactly the same order, then at least very, very similar. In fact, that second column there shows the average number of links for different political search terms that seemed personalized, that seemed to change depending on the person, and it's usually in the 1.3 to 2.9 range. So out of 10 search results that you're getting, maybe 20% are actually vary from user to user, and the rest is pretty much exactly the same. That's I think a really interesting study that again pushes strongly back against the filter bubble idea. The only cases where they did find variation in results was if someone had their browser set to a different language, or if they were participating from a different country. So they had a handful of users who participated, but who were based in France or in Russia or somewhere else. And they, of course, got different results, partly just because the results were largely in a different language. And German-based users who had their browsers set to a different language because German wasn't their first language, again, they got very different results because, again, Google would recognize that and give them results in their preferred language. So obviously there would be variation, but the speculation that they then made is also to say, well, if we had a whole bunch of people with that same language background or in that same country, then presumably within that country we'd find the same results again, that within the same language community, the results will be very similar again. This really pushes back very strongly against this idea of filter bubbles in search, I think. And just with these studies, we can probably put the filter bubble in search idea to rest for the time being, until and unless search engines end up personalizing their results much more thoroughly than they do at this point. If we see very limited evidence there for echo chambers and filter bubbles, why might that be? What's the story here? We have so much debate about these terms, but what's going on there? Why is the observable empirical reality so different from the discussion that's happening here? First, I think the problem is that we do often talk about individual case studies in some of the studies that claim to have found echo chambers and filter bubbles. Obviously, we start from anecdote, but also a number of the studies that find echo chambers and filter bubbles talk about particular case studies. So on Twitter, as you've seen in one of the examples I showed, they might look just at an individual hashtag data set, or a hashtag and keyword data set. So they might just look at individual cases. They often start out also from a topic or a context that is known to be highly polarized. So they look at discussions about global warming. They look at discussions about Trump or Clinton. They look at discussions about anti-vaccination. So clearly there are pre-existing strong polarized structures. And if you're choosing to then look at a hashtag that pushes maybe a particular point of view, that climate change is a hoax, so that vaccination is bad for you, well, you kind of know what you're going to find, I think, and you might find something that is genuinely ideologically pure. But the problem is, of course, these things don't exist in isolation, but they're embedded in a much more complex platform structure. Hashtags are not sealed off from the rest of Twitter. And people who participate in these hashtags still are exposed to other content on Twitter as well. Pages on Facebook don't exist in isolation either, but the people who are participating in those pages still have their own personal networks, their own personal profiles, and are quite likely to actually encounter other information from very different types of participants who are not perhaps driven by a particular ideological point of view either in those contexts. These individual case studies that sometimes do say that there are echo chambers or filter bubbles sometimes fail to recognize, I think, that constructs that they're seeing are really just the tip of the iceberg of a much more complex network of interconnections and interactions that exists on these individual platforms themselves. And in fact, in the broader uses of these platforms, of course, we have a huge amount of serendipity of people who are engaged in these platforms, who are just habitually sharing news, sharing updates, sharing ideas, sharing views, sharing all sorts of stuff that probably isn't following a particularly strongly ideological orientation. In fact, a lot of the context in which ordinary social media users engage with or encounter the news and encounter perhaps also political points of view is a non-political context. Non-political talk well outweighs political talk on these platforms. And people aren't predominantly making connections with each other either because of political reasons, because of ideological reasons, but because their friends, their family, their co-workers, they have shared interests outside of politics. Through these networks that I think dominate in these platforms, people will encounter serendipitously all sorts of perspectives, political and other perspectives, all sorts of news and news sources. So that's, I think, one of the key reasons that beyond these very selective individual case studies, we're seeing a lot of much more complex and undirected information exchanges happening here as well. You know, one of the key mechanisms for the formation of echo chambers and filter bubbles that people talk about is this idea of selective exposure, that we selectively choose to engage with content that confirms our existing political ideological views. And that may well be true. This is not necessarily a zero-sum game. That also means that we are then also, for the same reason, selectively avoiding alternative views that do not agree with us. So we might seek out, but if we happen to encounter serendipitously views that do not agree with our point of view, well, we might not read much further, but we're certainly not usually going to the trouble of blocking and excluding those views. We might just see them and move on. So there isn't a mechanism that connects these two directly with each other. And so there is still a lot of exposure to alternative views via these platforms, even if people are perhaps more actively seeking out views that agree with their point of view. And similarly, again, the other mechanism that is being talked a lot about in this context is homophily. So we are connecting also, of course, preferably with people who share our interests in some form, who have similar interest in whatever field that might be. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we are also actively disconnecting from others. We form clusters around particular topics. We see this in all of the network structures that I've shown. We see this in all of the network analyses that people are doing. Of course, people use social media. It's part of the reason that we have social media. It's part of the reason we call them social media, because we're connecting socially around shared interests. But it doesn't mean that we're actively excluding anyone who doesn't share those interests. And if you look at your own Facebook networks, perhaps, where you've got perhaps family and friends and co-workers and everyone else that you're connecting with who don't all share the same interests in model trains or whatever it is. So, you're not actively disconnecting from all of those just because your core interest is a particular thing. So again, this is not a zero-sum game. These are not linked with each other necessarily. Some of what the research, I think, tends to call echo chambers might in the end just be communities of interest. Yes, there are communities, clusters, whatever you want to call them, that connect around particular shared interests. And that could be everything from media and communication research to anti-vax. It could be anything from a particular style of music to alien conspiracy theories. Yes, people connect around these shared interests. That's not an echo chamber unless you also actively disconnect from everyone who doesn't share those interests. And that's not what we seem to be seeing from the data. Ultimately, this also means that, and we talk a lot about politics, of course, in this context, although you can use echo chambers and filter bubbles perhaps also more broadly to talk about connection patterns. But in terms of politics, it also means that there are lots of cross-ideological connections that remain. I think we need to, for instance, for a place like Facebook, distinguish between different affordances of the platform. Yes, a Facebook page that's around, let's say, stopping Adani, might be an engine of homophily. You find people there who share that interest, who share that particular point of view. So yes, that's an engine of homophily that connects you with others who have similar interests. But your profiles, for instance, are actually engines of context collapse, are engines through which all of the different contexts of your life are crashing into each other in often very unpredictable ways. And I'm sure most of us have experienced this at one point or another, that suddenly you've got your aunt talking to your coworker, or your coworker talking to an old school friend, and suddenly all of these different contexts are just sort of collapsing onto each other, independent of who they are, where they're from, what views, interests, ideologies they have. Because they don't connect around politics, they connect around a lot of other things. And this is, I think, one of the things that Pariser particularly, he sort of did an update when he kind of worked out that filter bubbles in search probably don't exist. He kind of did an update and kind of pivoted to social media. And in 2015 said, well, maybe I was wrong on search, but in social media, I'm definitely right, because we all connect with each other based on who our political compadres are. I don't know about you, but that's not how I connect on Facebook or Twitter. That's not really the core reason. I'm not thinking about, everyone I'm following, everyone I'm friending, are they ideologically pure? Are they the same sort of whatever I am as me, or am I allowed to connect with them if they're in the wrong party or whatever? So that's, I think, the fundamental flaw in this idea that, and maybe this is kind of reflective of the people who propose these ideas, that they are perhaps, yes, they are political junkies, they are strongly politically engaged, and good on them. But the vast majority of social media users actually aren't. And they're not making those connection choices based on whether they see others as political compadres. They might see them as compadres for other reasons, but not political. That means that there are lots of different politics that crash into each other constantly on these platforms. I think what this kind of certainly rules out are really hard echo chambers, hard filter bubbles that really are exclusionary, where you've got only heavy hyper-partisans connecting with each other for the most part. They are possible, certainly, but you kind of have to have really almost cultish devotion, I guess, to really select your connections and your interactions in these platforms based only on ideological compatibility. You can do it, sure, and there are some specialty platforms where that's perhaps more likely. So 8chan, 4chan, Gab, a bunch of these particularly alt-right platforms that are kind of specifically designed for these groups. But even these people are still, of course, using these platforms often to then kind of organize a raid on Twitter and to kind of cyber mob, someone they don't like on another platform. So even they're not entirely disconnected from the rest of the world. And in fact, there's plenty of studies that show that those hyper-partisan users are also highly active followers of mainstream news, for instance, because they need to know what to attack. They need to know what to argue against. They need to know how to counter whatever the New York Times is writing about them, or they need to know what Hillary's doing so they can attack her more. Many of these users are very, very active. In fact, we did a bit of preliminary analysis of linking patterns from Breitbart as a site. One of the sites it links to most is the New York Times. Those are not links that are speaking about the New York Times in a positive way, obviously, but they're linking to it because they need to attack it, because they want to criticize it. So they're linking to an article and then giving their followers the rebuttal immediately. So as a reader of Breitbart, I would, if I was one, actually be very well informed about what the New York Times is writing about. But I'd also be given the right ideological reading for it immediately. So that's an important point to also take in, that these, particularly people on the fringes, they're not actively disconnecting each other. In fact, they're quite actively connected with the mainstream in order to know how to attack the mainstream. So even if they're just developing conspiracy theories and new ways of sharing disinformation that counters what the mainstream media are reporting, but they're following the mainstream media very strongly, and they're talking back at it as well. It certainly is possible for some of these people to choose to put themselves into echo chambers and filter bubbles. And I kind of like this as an example. I almost cited Chris Kenney in the book, who at one point tweeted, "Man, I blocked some morons yesterday, eradicate all the hateful inanity from Twitter, and you might have a useful medium for swapping thoughts and information." So that clearly is an attempt. This guy with the wonderful name of minimum viable chalk responded, "So you built a echo chamber, congratulations." I mean, that's yes, sure. If Kenney was seriously doing this and really fully pushing through with it, then clearly, yes, that would end up building himself maybe an echo chamber on Twitter. But at the same time, of course, he's still also very well connected as a deputy editor of the Australian. He's also still very well connected to mainstream media, to views of all sides. So even then, he's not in an echo chamber fundamentally. He's still encountering all of these arguments and counter arguments as well. So it is actually genuinely, you kind of have to live in a cave somewhere and only connect via a particular medium in order to really properly put yourself into an echo chamber or a filter bubble. Some people might do that. We call them survivalists, but it's otherwise very, very hard to do that, I think. And ultimately, I think that's sort of the really the big flaw in all of this. I think a lot of the debate and a lot of the arguments around echo chambers and filter bubbles are ultimately have a very strong sort of techno-determinist angle to them as well. Fundamentally, I hope we can all agree humans are pretty complicated, and their views are not necessarily consistent, reliable, and that also means they're very difficult actually to mine effectively via algorithms. Now, we talk a lot about the quality of Facebook's and others' algorithms, but ultimately they can only provide so much personalization of the information that people encounter. Our own interests, our own networks are fundamentally complex, are fundamentally inconsistent. An algorithm might push you in a particular direction or might give you particular information that it thinks you will like, but ultimately that's still flawed. It simply does not eradicate all of the kind of the counter information that you will also encounter. If you look at your own feeds on social media, I think you'll see that as well. Unless, again, you are one of these people who have a very streamlined and one-directional network of connections, perhaps because you've shaped it in that way yourself. And also beyond that, of course, we're not simply existing on individual platforms, but we exist across multiple platforms, mainstream media, social media, and other face-to-face and everything else. So all of that put together, so the mainstream information sources that circulate in our networks, or electronically and otherwise, the random serendipity that our connections introduce, the people that we engage with, what they share, what they talk about, what they obsess about, all of that ultimately still generates a very mixed information diet that ordinary people encounter. In fact, some of the work that the Reuters Institute has done has shown that people who use social media actively as a source for news tend to encounter a larger number of sources in an average week, and of different sources in an average week than people who don't. Some longitudinal studies in the US have shown that the greatest polarization has occurred in areas where there is very poor internet service. So there's a strong argument to be made that actually social media and online and internet connection overall increase rather than decrease the diversity of people's information diet as well. There is obviously an element of moral panic, an element of kind of, there's a new technology, we don't know what it means, but it must be bad about this as well. Sunstein and Pariser very much build on personal and anecdotal evidence. There isn't much there that they really provide us empirical evidence. A lot of what they provide are thought experiments or extrapolations from the starting point, saying, well, if everything gets more personalized, then eventually we'll end up with echo chambers and filter bubbles. Well, that may well be the case, but everything isn't getting more personalized in the way that they're starting from. So they're starting from a false premise ultimately, and the development ultimately is quite different from what they predict because they're starting from that false premise. I think we also continue to overestimate the power of AI, the power of algorithms. Algorithms are important, are critical, and we need to understand them better. There's no question about that. But I think we're also overestimating the role that they play in shaping our information diets. And that's going back at least to Negroponte in 1995 with the Daily Me. So we need to, I think, push back and be a little bit more cautious about how we actually conceptualize these and what we think they're doing to our information diets. David Weinberger, who actually wrote a critical review of the first book by Sunstein called Republic that talked about the echo chamber, already at that point said, well, the echo chamber, from my perspective, is a myth just waiting to concretize into common wisdom. I think we've actually gone beyond that point. I think it has become such a widely circulating concept as rarely really questioned. So I think we do need to start questioning that more and more. I mean, I'd say that because I've just written a book about it, but I think we do actually need to push back and really think through, well, do we have the evidence that supports this, or is this just a metaphor that's sort of floating around without much evidence to back it up? I think the darker undercurrent about all of this is also that these terms can be used, of course, in a very handy way by people who are interested in doing so to shift blame towards social media companies, search engines, big tech, however you define it. These platforms and these companies, there's a lot to blame them for, no doubt, but I don't think it's echo chambers and filter bubbles. So that's, I think, but it's become a very convenient tool, obviously, to attack them and say, well, you must be doing more about echo chambers and filter bubbles, and if not, we'll break you up, or if not, we'll do one thing or another, we'll regulate you in different ways. There are lots of good reasons to regulate. The distribution of the Christchurch video is one example. Clearly, there are very important reasons to regulate these platforms, but I don't think echo chambers and filter bubbles are actually the appropriate reason to do it. I think there are many other problems there: hate speech, abuse, lack of moderation for really awful content. But that's got nothing to do with echo chambers and filter bubbles. In fact, the distribution of that content, the widespread distribution of that content, goes right against the argument that there are echo chambers and filter bubbles. Because if we had them, then presumably this content would stay much more in them rather than spreading right across the network. So I think there are certainly some people who continue to work with these terms who are doing so because they are handy kind of axes to grind, rather than necessarily very smart. In fact, there's a wonderful quote from a German journalist who kind of summed up much of this argument, saying that filter bubbles are the dumbest metaphor on the internet. And I kind of have to agree, to be honest. I think it really is a metaphor that's gone way out of hand. It's a very handy and very evocative metaphor, but I just don't think it's based in fact. And ultimately, I think it's actually distracting us now from much more significant challenges. I think the problem now is not what echo chambers and filter bubbles predict, which is that people just don't see content that doesn't agree with their political views. I think the problem is that people see that content, but just reject it out of hand. You, an anti-vaxxer or an alt-righter or whatever else, whoever else you want to talk about, they see content that doesn't agree with them, but they immediately have an answer to it and say, well, that's just, the deep state, or that's just that's just the global world government or whatever. So the question is really, what do people do when they encounter information that doesn't agree with their worldviews? Do they dismiss it out of hand, or do they actually engage with it in some form? That's really the much more fundamental problem from my point of view, that so many people are just readily dismissive of it. I mean, that I think is the problem. And again, I kind of go back there. This is a really nice quote again from that Weinberger review, who says, the problem with an extraterrestrial conspiracy mailing list isn't that it's an echo chamber, it's that it thinks there's a conspiracy by extraterrestrials. I think we could say the same now as well. The problem isn't that there are hyper-partisan echo chambers or filter bubbles. The problem is that there's hyper-partisan fringe groups that fundamentally reject and actively fight any mainstream and societal and democratic consensus. These groups, it's not that they're in filter bubbles and echo chambers, it's that they're there in the first place, that they've been able to grow and now command, a significant part of the vote and significant support in society. So, that I think is the problem that we need to tackle, not this question about echo chambers and filter bubbles. These groups are there, but they're there for other reasons, I think, and we need to understand those reasons and try and push back against them. So the problem for me is political polarization, much more so than communicative fragmentation. There isn't much evidence that communication is actually as fragmented as echo chambers and filter bubbles would suggest. But the problem certainly is that we are getting more polarized by any measure, it seems. And again, there are important and interesting questions also how we might measure polarization, how we would, my suggestion is that there is political polarization that is growing. But we probably also need better empirical evidence that that's the case, and that that's not just my own political perspective. There isn't really an echo chamber or filter bubble. The filter, if there is one, is in our heads, is in everyone's heads as they encounter information that disagrees with them. So how is it that someone who is, let's say, an anti-vaxxer, staunch anti-vaxxer, can encounter all of this information about how measles are making a comeback and not say, well, maybe I'm wrong? How is it that that just reinforces their views? That's the question. And that's just one example, but that's, I think, the question. And that's maybe it's almost a media effects, a media psychology question, I guess. So we've kind of got to engage with those sorts of questions, I think, much more again now. Just to finish up then, where I think certainly I'm interested in going, I think many of us should go more, is understanding this question of polarization. How can we assess it? How can we work out whether, how it compares across countries, whether it's growing or lessening, how it's distributed in society, so who's perhaps most vulnerable to it, whatever. How does this happen at the individual level? How do individuals kind of slide into this hyperpartisanship? How do they get captured by these highly fringe kind of discourses, and how, if possible, can this be reversed? And yes, of course, this is a political perspective that this is not desirable. From some perspectives, you could argue, well, let them do what they want to do, and we have to accept it. But I think we probably need to take a more activist role here in order to ultimately save democracy and save society. And then how do these hyperpartisan groups actually work? How do they process the information that comes their way that doesn't agree with their worldview? How do they find the arguments internally to dismiss that and push back against it? How do they also actively kind of push into the mainstream by disseminating misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, all the other stuff that they do as well? So what are the mechanisms here of polarization and of interaction between polarized groups? How can we push back against this? Again, this is a value judgment that we need to push back against it, of course. How can we protect at least mainstream society from further hyperpartisanship? How can we counter this misinformation, disinformation? I'm trying to avoid the term fake news, but it's in the background there obviously as well, that's circulating. What's the role of digital media literacy? And I think they're particularly concerned that much of what these fringe groups are doing is actually using media literacy incredibly effectively for their own purposes. Because what they're doing is essentially to train their followers to say, if it's in the New York Times, or if it's on the ABC, or if it's on the Guardian, you know where that's coming from. You understand how they're produced. You understand who's producing them. So take all of that immediately with a grain of salt. In much the same way that we might do the same, I'm making a big assumption here, we might do the same about stuff that's coming from Breitbart or Russia Today. Well, we're also saying, well, you know where that's coming from. You know who's producing that. You know what the ideology is. So we're both using media literacy in this fight in much the same way. We're just directing it at different targets. How can we reclaim media literacy for societal good and prevent its abuse, or is that even possible? And so what we need for this, well, I'm coming from media and communication studies, obviously, so I think there is still a lot of value coming out of understanding information flows, understanding information, opinion leadership, influence, and so on, and particularly in the context of digital media, of course. So there's a lot of that can happen. There's, of course, almost ancient cultural studies work now that looks at negotiated oppositional readings and so on. And again, we need to go back to those sorts of, that sort of work as well, because that's ultimately also what these hyperpartisan, what these fringe groups are doing. There's media psychology and how we process the content that we engage with. There's digital media work as well that looks at news engagement, I think particularly. I think that's an important field to do more on. And in education, of course, there is this question of digital media literacy as well, and how we kind of bring all of that into the frame as well. There's a lot to be done there, but none of this is actually about echo chambers and filter bubbles anymore. A lot of this, I think, is much more about polarization. It's much more about how people engage with media content and incorporate that into their worldview, or redefine and reinterpret it in order to fit their worldview. So that's, I think, where a lot of the work will need to go in future, and in the very near future, because this is very much a pressing issue, I think, at this point. It's not something that we can spend a lot of time just sitting on the sidelines as I think polarization increases and continues. So on that happy note, I might leave it there. So that's sort of the overview of what is in the book.
Are there any questions, son? I come to this as a historian of the newspaper industry, particularly in the 18th and a little bit in the 19th century. And I guess we would think about the arguments that are made around media in that formative period for modern democratic thought and so forth. There's two major theoretical models which have been enormously discussed. One is the Habermasian model, where we might argue whether he's actually setting up a fictitious utopia or whether he's actually trying to describe a historical reality. It's initially a fairly small elite group of people who, particularly through the media and other social groupings, were having rational, critical discussions where they were interfacing with government and political authority, and therefore changing society, and those rational, critical debates largely informed policy. And then Habermas argued that in the 19th and early 20th century, large corporate interests and the state seized control of those media, so we get a sort of nightmare that informs Chomsky's thought on the later 20th century. And the fragmentation through media structures of national audiences and where that leads us, which seemed to me to be accelerated by the coming of digital media, by the incredible proliferation of media channels, but also alternative media where people may indeed be acting as citizens, but perhaps in small groups and filter bubbles, and how that would undermine society. So where does this take me? Well, firstly, I wonder whether there's still some residual things we can find in that worldview that can actually enrich and historicise what you're doing. The other thing is that in our own critical work as a team on this, looking at certainly the Habermasian model, I have to say in some ways it was ever thus as well. There seem to be stages in the development and uptake of any new media where society and the authorities that have provided a certain stability seem to come under particular challenge. And it seems to me that if we were looking at the earlier technologies, we could read back some of these things to, say, the Reformation and the take-up of forces hostile to the unifying Catholic Church, of alternative religious and worldviews. And that was cataclysmic for an extended period until the Roman Catholic Church and other forms of authority evolved, emerged, and developed strategies for dealing with it. And then again, we seem to get something in Western society connected to the news media I studied from about the 1760s and 1770s on, where, contrary to what Habermas argued, in state after state, we see an increasingly, literally murderous polarization taking place as news media becomes more partisan. There seems to be less common middle ground, and the extreme voices are able to incite direct action and violence and hatred to the opposition. And that happens in America, North America. It happens earlier in Britain in the English Civil War. It happens, and who's to say which is the cause or effect, in the French Revolution, the Dutch Revolution. I can pinpoint all those things. It's often connected with a fragmentation as well of the elites who, when elites stick together, societies are generally stable. I think that there are all sorts of parallels there when one wants to look at the processes of polarization and also divergences that could really enrich the model. And, my mind is really, really excited by this. I can't wait to read it in more detail. Yeah. I wonder if you've got any comments on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I have to apologize. I probably should have put media history on there as well as a field. Actually, that's
I noticed it was missing.
Yes, well, but you're absolutely right, of course. Yes, and in many ways, I mean, I mentioned this idea of perhaps the idea of filter bubbles, echo chambers, and just the rise of particularly social media as a moral panic, as something that causes a moral panic as well. I think that there's a certain element to this. And again, we've seen this with pretty much every other media form as it's emerged. We've seen moral panics around various broadcast media, around print when newspapers really first arrived in full. We've seen it with many other media technologies, well, probably back to the alphabet. So in that sense, yes, absolutely. And there is that point of disruption, obviously, that happens, and that can lead to a polarization, certainly between the ones who are using and not using these new technologies. It can lead to, particularly as there are, as the industry structure remains unsettled, of course, you might have some very different outlets or some very different platforms that capture only a part of the populace, and therefore lead to a kind of a differential in information consumption, in the information diet, obviously. So yes, I mean, all of that I think needs to be brought back in, and I think we are still in a process of obviously that disruption right now, with the decline in spite of everything, and in spite of even the rise in subscriptions to the New York Times, whatever, of the mainstream news media, and the rise of online and social media as an important first source. Again, if you look at the data from the Reuters Institute, for certainly younger population groups right around the world now, social media and online media are becoming the lead medium through which they consume or encounter the news. They might not actively seek to consume it, but at least they encounter the news that way. So there is a very significant disruption going on. And in terms of, I found it interesting, Habermas did this keynote at RCA in 2006, and at that point sort of gently incorporated the internet into his kind of ideas about the public sphere. Although he's not quite, I think, fully connected to all of this, but he did talk there about the some language there around the wild flow of messages on the edges of the public sphere, which I think referred in many ways to this much more unbridled online communication that isn't necessarily through the major mastheads and through, you know, controlled mainstream media spaces, but much more what I guess Manuel Castells would call mass self-publication, all of that. I think that's where I mean, in my mind, essentially, what I'm seeing is that if we're starting from a Habermasian model, that sort of public sphere part, the central part of the arena of elite discourse that's conducted through mainstream media as a total of the media space is kind of shrinking, and that there's much more of these wild flows of messages that are growing through social media, through online, you know, self-directed online media platforms. And that reshaping of the balance, I think, means that yes, there is a fragmentation, if you like, or at least a splintering of the discussion away from the central media narrative to all of these individual narratives that happen in all sorts of individual communities. But at the same time, all of these communities also overlap to a certain amount, a certain extent, because they share participants. You know, I might be in a discussion group about music, and maybe there's a bit of political talk in there as well, and then I'm in a discussion group about football and a discussion group about what, and so I'm a connector between these groups, and many other people are as well. So you've got all these overlapping communities, clusters, whatever you want to call them, that replace, but not fully and not one for one replace the kind of the national debate as it existed in the 70s or 80s in the mainstream, particularly broadcast media. So that's, I think, a really significant transformation. And maybe that has a lot, well, very likely that has a lot to do with the trend towards polarization. But again, it's I think something different from filter bubbles and echo chambers, which would mean that all these communities just exist in isolation and share no connections with others outside of themselves.
Yes, okay, I'll give you another model that may be of interest. I'm from Eastern Europe, and from, say, the Baltic states in the north to the, say, Moldova in the south, you've got a situation of some regard as exclusive information spheres. Those countries contain a large number of previous Soviet citizens that are largely Russian-speaking, not entirely, and the media that they watch is the Russian media, which is beamed in or produced locally as well. What happens, however, is some odd things. Firstly, there's quite a lot of Russian engagement with the media in the national language in that space. We think it's exclusive and it's certainly politically polarized, but there seems to be some overlap. Secondly, of course, when those Russian speakers, if they ever do go back to Russia to meet their families there or so on, they're regarded as, oh, they've got funny attitudes. They're sort of like, you know, they don't sort of share exactly all the prejudices that they do in Russia and that's produced through Russia Today that you mentioned. It seems that even in a very what is clearly an exclusive zone when people are basically watching Russian language media all the time. There still seems to be this what might be regarded as seepage or cross-fertilization or whatever, even in those very, very hard cases. And I think that might actually give some ideas also for the research in the social media, which I'm less familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. And there actually are some interesting studies that are starting to emerge about particularly Vkontakte, which is the Russian language kind of Facebook clone, if you like. That's slightly unkind, and they're not exactly the same, but that's sort of the big medium in Russian language. There are some interesting studies, for instance, about interconnections between Ukrainian and Russian users, particularly around the Crimean conflict, of course. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on, which also, again, I don't know enough about. The fertilization, as you're saying, between some of the state-controlled media, between some of the alternative media to the extent that they operate. Of course, then also into Western mainstream as well as social media. There's some very interesting information flows, as well as, of course, some very orchestrated attempts to control or shape those flows. I mean, Russia's now talking about creating its own internet, for instance. So that's an interesting sign that there is perhaps a seepage that they want to stop as well. I think it's a fascinating field, particularly also because of the history of course, Western Eastern media during the Cold War as well. But yeah, again, another area that we need to understand much better still.
What if people have always been as polarized and ignorant as they are? Maybe what if there is no new polarization and people have always said all the misinformed, incorrect stuff they say? The difference is when they say it online is trackable data using the kinds of techniques that you're using.
Yep.
Whereas when they're all saying it in their houses, using their voices, it's much harder for us as researchers to capture it and map it.
Look, that's quite possible. And of course, the other part of that, though, is also if you're saying it online, you might also have a much better chance of finding others who agree with you, and for it to travel much further as well. So that I think is genuinely a difference. But yes, it is quite possible that somewhere underneath all of this, these sort of polarizations were always already there. But really the question is, well, if we're doing this through different media forms, does something like the spiral of silence, for instance, work in a different way? If you're the only person in your town who is a staunch whatever supporter of whatever ideology, you'll probably keep that quiet because you don't want to, be shown to be different from the rest of your town. If you can do it online, if you can find others that way, well, that can be very empowering, obviously, for you, but it can also mean that you could choose to polarize yourself further and become more partisan and perhaps be radicalized in that way as well, because suddenly you find that there's all these other people out there who believe in the same thing as you as well. There is a role that online and social media play in all of this that makes it qualitatively different, or that enables it to travel further or to reinforce your beliefs further or whatever. But again, it's very difficult to kind of empirically understand that without also having the alternative point of comparison.
I guess it sort of comes down to this, circumstance we're in now, historically, globally, with across at least many countries, sort of rise and consolidation, right, of right-wing populist movements obtaining power to govern. And the kind of question that is prompted by studies like yours is, well, how is that so, right? And it makes me wonder, a number of things, but one, for instance, would be, what sort of role does political economy play in consolidating these different platforms against the kind of forces that seem to run against them? And here I'm thinking of the kind of role of the protocol in making possible transversal relations across bubbles and filters, when at the same time the platform logic protocologically would seem to present an obstacle to such transversality in terms of, filter bubbles making these kind of network connections. And when we then set that against, the kind of most recent event we've experienced, of course, is the election year, but we could go back to any number of other events like Egypt, the Arab Revolution, Spring Revolution there, and the extent to which social media was cultivating and playing into political dispositions and subjectivities, perceptions, up against a history of accumulated disaffection that's dispersed across society, regardless of the filter bubble. and to the extent which we also then need to make a sort of inquiry into these offline worlds, if you like, that aren't registering in a study of filter bubbles because of their non-digitality. And then maybe there's a sort of route in all of that to sort of have some account of our election here and what the Prime Minister calls the quiet Australian, strangely enough, what Beaudry, of course, called the silent majority, and how whoever this sort of majority is, manages to connect politically through a kind of logic of non-connection. These are just sort of problematics, questions, curiosities, challenges thrown up to the sort of study that you've done. I guess the question is, what moment does a constitutive outside penetrate the bubble?
Well, and this is the thing. I mean, I probably didn't say enough about this, but I mean, for me, one of the really important aspects with all of this, and one of the reasons I'm saying there are no filter bubbles and echo chambers in that sense, is that, yeah, we don't just exist within individual spaces on these platforms. We don't just exist within individual platforms, but all of these, there's context collapse basically across all of this, offline as well as online. And all of this is interwoven with each other. And that's, I think, part of the problem is whatever studies keep telling us, yes, we found evidence of echo chambers, is a very small tip of the iceberg of a much broader network that these people are in that probably shows that there aren't in echo chambers. So I think you're right, absolutely. The offline component particularly needs to be brought into this much more. And we can't just look at the online elements of all of this. The protocol stuff, I think, is interesting in that context as well, because in many ways, you're right, from a particular point of view or in a particular context on a given platform, the platform might push you to form these sorts of clusters or whatever. In other contexts, though, on the same platform, it might also push you against that. So on the one hand, Facebook offers group and page functionality, and that's clearly designed to connect around a shared interest, at the very basic. At the same time, it also wants to know as much about your life as possible. So it wants you to connect around all of the different interests that you have and engage with all of these different communities at the same time, and ideally have all of them come together on your profile, where all of your friends and family and other connections are kind of seeing you in this really complex, multifaceted persona that you are. For me, that means the profile is sort of an engine of context collapse, and the page or the group is an engine of, not quite echo chamber, but certainly of cluster formation. And so in the same platform, you've got tendencies that go exactly against each other, I think. And I think the same is true with Twitter and other platforms as well. On Twitter, it's the hashtag perhaps versus, again, the personal connection network. We've got to be careful not to say a platform does this, but a particular set of affordances on the platform does this, but another set of affordances on the same platform might do exactly the opposite. And that's also by design. It's also by as a result of the political economy of the platform. What Facebook wants is as much data about you as possible. It doesn't just want you to be an anti-vaxxer. Wants you to be an anti-vaxxer and a soccer mom and a whatever, I guess. So, that's part of the story as well. And that's, I think, where things get very complex very, very quickly.